Back at the house, Neo put on his work boots and approached the mirror hanging up next to the front door. He once again cringed and put a hand to his head. The pulse in his ears had returned. It went away and he blinked at his reflection a few times before putting his hand down. He grabbed his briefcase, leaning against the bottom of the coat hanger before going for his coat. The pulse briefly resumed and stopped again. He quickly recovered and decided against bringing his coat, exiting the house and closing the door behind him firmly.
Neo double-locked the door and made his way towards his Vauxhall Victor. He jumped in and rested his briefcase on the passenger side seat. He made himself comfortable in his chair before sticking the key in the ignition. Suddenly, as he prepared to drive, Neo heard the pulse again. He put his hand to his head and tightly shut his eyes. He leaned forward towards the wheel. Flashes of disturbing imagery of Hattie appeared before Neo's eyes. She was naked except for underpants and a silky see-through shawl, running in slow motion towards Neo through a black void littered with bloody cobwebs. He saw another image of his 2 children in torn-up bloody clothing with bleeding wounds, crawling around on all fours like animals. He then saw his own face staring directly at him with wide, bloodshot eyes. He saw a third-person perspective of himself as a child receiving the pocket watch from his grandfather. Finally, Neo saw the article about the crybaby killer in the black void. He began to see all the individual hallucinations for half a second at a time before gaining the strength to open his eyes, snapping himself out of it as the pulse and accompanying headache stopped. He could hear knocking on the window of the passenger side door. Neo turned his head and saw Eric Sokol, his friendly neighbour. He had slicked back hair that was already greying despite his relatively young age of 32, a muscular build, was dressed in a boiler suit, and was wearing a black wristwatch. Neo waited a moment before lowering his window. "Sorry to intrude, Neo," said Eric. "Everything okay?" Neo opened his mouth to say something before the pulse suddenly returned at a fast pace. Eric tried talking, but his voice was little more than an echo in Neo's dissociating mind. Neo managed to recompose himself and shook his head. "Yes, I'm fine, Eric," said Neo. It's just a minor headache is all. How are you?" "Yeah, I'm fine, thanks," said Eric. "You sure you're alright to go in? Even if I wasn't, it's too late to call in now." Good. I was going to ask, actually. My car's broken down and it's still in the shop, so could I..." Neo agreed without even letting Eric finish, reaching over to open the passenger door. Eric moved the briefcase onto the back seats and jumped straight in. He closed the door and made himself comfortable. Neo put the car into drive and very slowly reversed out onto the street. "I sure do appreciate it, Smite," said Eric as he put his belt on. "I'll have to get back to the mechanics after work, so don't worry about dropping me home." "Alright," said Neo. "Let's go then." Once the car was out on the road, the 2 men ventured onwards to their shared destination. Not long after they drove off, the family wagon approached the house and parked on the driveway. Just before Neo turned a corner, Eric saw the wagon in the rearview mirror. "Huh," he said. "Looks like we just missed Hattie. That's a shame." Neo did not even acknowledge the remark as he turned the corner. Outside the house, Hattie and Betty jumped out of the car clutching their bags. Hattie locked the wagon and led Betty towards the front door. "So I know you don't have much in the way of coffee, but you got much in the way of liquor?" asked Betty. "It's a bit early for that, isn't it?" said Hattie. "Only if you think it is." "I do, yes." "Well, it's a good thing I don't." Betty rushed past Hattie up the steps of the porch and stood by the front door, telling Hattie she was ready if she was. Hattie, completely unamused, opened the front door. Betty followed her into the house. Once they settled, Hattie poured Betty some whiskey into a rocks glass with a large ice cube, causing the cube to crack as it became wet. "Jesus, that's a lot!" said Betty in surprise. "That's normally how much Neo drinks," said Hattie. "Really? When was the last time you poured yourself a drink?" "I only ever have a small glass of wine once in a blue moon. I don't really like to drink." "Well, get yourself pouring, Hat. I can't do this alone." "I have to drive later to pick up the children, remember?"
Betty pulled a face, looked around the room, and made suggestive eye contact with Hattie as she took a large sip of her drink. "My darling daughter is staying over at Karen's mother's house," she said. "I need not worry about a thing. And neither will you. Just drink some water afterwards and you'll sober up. Betty, let me make it clear that I'm not very sure about it, alright? You gotta unwind a little, Hattie. I won't force you, I just don't want you to feel like you have to be so tense all the time. The house looks nice and clean, so you don't have to do that while you wait all afternoon. Wish I could keep things looking this good. I just get South's sister to do it whenever she comes round." Hattie thought to herself for a moment before leaving the room for the kitchen. Betty, feeling somewhat disappointed, took one of her sleeves off of her shoulder and had another sip of her drink. She was delighted by the taste. When Hattie re-entered the room, she pleasantly surprised Betty with her own rocks glass with a large ice cube inside of it. Hattie took a seat in her armchair and looked at Betty, who gave her a warm smile. Hattie gave her a twitch of a smile with one corner of her mouth before holding her hand out. "Scotch me," she said. "First of all, it's bourbon, not scotch," said Betty. "And second of all, I'm sorry, but you're the host. Who said I had to serve you?" "Well, why don't you loosen up a little?" Jokingly, Betty dropped her jaw and put a hand to her chest. She removed her shoes before lifting her legs up onto the couch and gently grasping her glass with both hands. Hattie did not look impressed. "I'm being serious," she said. "All right, then," Betty scoffed. Betty stood up, put her glass down, grabbed the decanter off of the alcohol tray, approached Hattie from behind, leaned over the backrest of her armchair, and poured some whiskey into her host's glass, causing another beautiful sensation of the ice cube cracking as it became drenched in spirit. "Not too much," said Betty. "Don't want you falling over." Betty returned the decanter to the tray. She cheered Hattie before returning to her seat in the middle of the couch. Hattie initially struggled with her drink before the effect of it made her enjoy it a little more. Within Fiona's English classroom, Miss Jafari was teaching her class about Niccolò Amaniti's novel I'm Not Scared. Despite her intimidating appearance, Jafari was actually a very understanding and not at all strict educator, paying closer attention to her underperforming students in a genuine attempt to further educate them. The specific scene Jafari was in the middle of reading was when Michele's mother, Anna, comforted her son following her violent brawl with Felice in the kitchen. Although not the only student to barely pay attention, Fiona was entirely in her own world, sketching more designs in her journal as Miss Jafari intently read the tear-jerking words a fierce-turned-broken mother shared with her son. "When you grow up, you must go away from here and never come back," said Miss Jafari before closing the book. Obviously that was quite a grim and, well, violent scene. I want you to write how you think, in that moment, the characters feel, and describe in as much detail as possible what you think the consequences will be for Michele following these events. Maybe his father will be upset, maybe Felice will enact some kind of revenge. What do you think will result from this? And please, serious answers only, because this is a very pivotal, important, and dark part of the novel. Try and include that if you can. The class began to discuss and write, the only exception being Fiona as she continued to design. Miss Jafari noticed Fiona, but the child didn't even bat an eye at her teacher. Jafari walked over to Fiona's desk and crouched down to her level. Fiona still didn't look away from what she was doing. "Are you enjoying the book, Fiona?" said Miss Jafari. "Not really," said Fiona. "I don't like the way Felice did that to Mama. She's rude, but she's lovely. She's a bit like my mummy." "Well, how do you think those characters felt in that scene? All of them. What was going through their minds, do you think?" They probably weren't very happy." "Well, that's a start. What do you think will happen to Michele?" "I don't know. He might... I hope it's all okay and Filippo gets to go home." "That's thinking just a little bit too far ahead. How will they, as in the characters directly involved in this scene, feel just after what happened? What's going on in their minds, eh? What might happen to them, or what will they do? Do you understand? A little, said Fiona while shrugging her shoulders. You don't have to write anything down, Fiona, said Miss Jafari. Just think about it. If you feel like sharing with the class, just raise your hand. It's just... I don't like thinking about that stuff. It's very dark. Well, believe me, I'd rather you read Pinocchio. Fiona snickered and Miss Jafari gave her a smile. Jafari looked down at Fiona's journal and was genuinely impressed by her extravagant designs. You seem more interested in arts and crafts of each passing day, said Miss Jafari. It's just what I enjoy, said Fiona. I don't enjoy grown men attacking Italian ladies. Miss Jafari chuckled before assuring Fiona she understood. She stood up and returned to the front of the classroom, leaving Fiona to continue her sketches undisturbed. Deep within the ribcage of the city was the industrial warehouse Neo worked in. It was a large building filled to the last possible space with giant racking shelves with large, medium and small boxes, men on forklifts moving boxes around, men moving smaller things around or having a chat, a couple white-collar superiors looking over some documents on a clipboard as they pointed things out, and a higher-up named Nathan Carter helping to relocate some larger boxes from one area to another by simply pointing his pen and bossing the blue-collar boys around. Nathan was a suave, permanently smirking man with slick hair and bright eyes, holding a folder under his arm. His outfit was considerably more stylish than the other higher-up employees in an effort to subtly boast his wealth. He was in charge of overseeing workers and recording absences, primarily following up his latter occupation by changing shifts and organising fill-ins. He went over something in his folder before approaching two supervisors standing nearby. The first supervisor was a 50-year-old man with a comb-over, brow-line glasses, and an all-black suit with a white shirt, red tie, and silver cufflinks. The second supervisor, a 49-year-old white-haired, slightly pudgy, rather boring-looking man, directed Nathan to a door in the warehouse leading to an office. The writing on the door read, Neo Smite, Head of Finances. Within his office, Neo was hard at work simultaneously going over paperwork while he spoke on the phone in regards to an underpayment from a supply store. His office was vibrant and spacious, given he was a long-term, well-respected member of the company. The main colour scheme was red and green for everything soft and plastic, and chocolate for the wood. His desk was complete with a gold nameplate, a couple of pens and pencils, a typewriter, and a telephone. Nathan gently knocked on the door and Neo waved for him to enter as he continued to speak on the phone. Well, worst case scenario, we'll have to send one of the guys from corporate down to collect it personally, said Neo. Alright, that's fine. Yep. Okay, thank you. Alright then, goodbye. And you. Bye. Neo hung up the phone. Nathan took a seat in the chair on the other side of the desk, still smiling ever so slyly as he dropped the folder in front of Neo. Irregularities, eh? Said Nathan. You don't think they're trying to cheat us, do you? Neo took the folder and put it aside as he continued to go over some numbers. Not them, he said. They're too straight-edge for that. Probably just some new employee that overlooked the total and someone upstairs didn't think anything of it. Always optimistic. It beats killing people over it. Nathan snickered before suggesting that Neo go over the folder. After a second, Neo stopped what he was doing and went through the documents within. Furland isn't in again? He asked as he pulled a face. He called in yesterday to say his wife didn't feel well, said Nathan. Food poisoning or something. And no one can cover him? No. He'll have to make those reductions to his salary. He's taking the piss at this point. Oh, for God's sake. And Terence, Clarence, Eli, and Ronaldo. Great! Disgruntled, Neo threw the folder and its contents back onto the desk and leaned back into his chair with a deep sigh. Every fella makes a difference, eh? Said Nathan. I don't have much to do after this that I can't put off until tomorrow, said Neo. I suppose I can always put myself on the floor. Are you sure? I could use the overtime. Keeps me out of the house. Jones wants me to take it easy, hence why I came in at 9:15, but I can handle it. Don't you want to get back to your family a little quicker? No, thank you. Hattie and I aren't exactly getting along at the moment. It's fine, but it's very awkward and stiff. I can't describe it, but the less of each other that we see at the moment, the better. That's a little more information than I needed, pal. Neo apologised before blaming his oversharing on his headache as it began to persist once again. Nathan asked Neo if he had any cigarettes. Once Neo said he didn't, Nathan, as a semi-kind gesture, took one from his own packet and handed it to Neo. He put it to his lips and thanked Nathan. "You'll need it," said Nathan. "It's a battlefield out there today." "Funny part is I actually wore my boots for this exact scenario," said Neo as he sparked up. Nathan snickered before gathering his folder and leaving the office. As the work continued around him, Nathan stood still for a moment and his smile faded as he entered deep thought. He began to chuckle and walked across the warehouse towards his own office. He pulled a card out of his inner breast pocket and looked at it, suddenly becoming very horny as he thought about the number. Back in his office, Neo finished his cigarette and grabbed his grandfather's watch off of the desk before the pulse in his head started again. He stopped and cringed in pain, seeing half-second flashes of his grandfather giving him the watch, his children still wearing torn clothing and covered in blood crawling around, and one of the warehouse forklifts doing donuts in a black void with a disfigured, mutant-like thing with a split-open head operating it. He slammed his fist on the desk in rage, causing the visions and headache to suddenly stop. Still looking at the ground, he took the watch before standing up and grabbing his warehouse-friendly boiler suit off of a coat hanger in the corner. Back at the Smite house, Hattie and Betty had switched to red wine, smoking a cigarette with their own ashtray each. Betty was laughing uncontrollably at the revelation that Hattie and Neo's sex life was now non-existent. While Hattie was trying to see humour in it as well, she had an internalised seriousness that caused Betty's laughing to irritate her. "I still can't believe you don't even fuck anymore," said Betty. "He's just so goddamn reserved these days," said Hattie. "He's always working or ever so occasionally when he feels like it, keeping the kids occupied on a weekend so I can relax and do some work around the house, like ironing or wiping things down. God forbid, I actually kind of miss him disappearing with the men from work every now and then. He can't even be bothered with that." Betty thought for a moment, taking a large puff and gulping her wine. "I don't even know why you married that guy other than security, of course," she said. "But even then you'd think something more exciting would have come your way." The remark touched a nerve. Hattie tried to brush it off by having another large toke off of her cigarette. "Fun-loving girls like us just have to be patient," said Betty. "I know I can be just as stern and uninvolved as he can," said Hattie. "I always have been, but that's how I was raised. I do have my moments. Sometimes I can be fun. He just doesn't take advantage of it when I try to show it." "Sounds like my Sal. We get it done, but there's not as much spice as there was in the beginning. Sometimes I think we only ever do it so we can get that son he wants. I'm not even on that contraceptive pill." It was Tom. As soon as he was born, I knew I'd be stuck. Does my Neo believe in condoms, though? No, of course he doesn't. Betty concurred and raised her glass. Both women downed what remained of their wine, and Hattie put her cigarette out. "I don't mind having Fiona around, she's just so different," said Hattie. "I thought I could raise someone who'd be interested in some of the things I like to do. We could paint our nails together, go to the hairdressers, but she's completely disinterested. All she does at school is keep to herself and do minimal work, and whenever she's around here, she just turns those sketches she does into real things. She's constantly customizing and making her own clothes. You wouldn't think the materials we buy for her actually end up costing more than the actual clothing, but that's because she demands so much from us. Which kind of annoys me, the little brat. You know, when little Francesca was born, I felt the exact same way," said Betty. "And I still do. It's more like work than nurturing. She likes nothing I like. It just gets more boring than anything for me." Betty was slightly put off by Hattie's lack of care for her issues. She put her glass on the ground and stood up, taking the rocks glass with her as she seemingly made her way over to the alcohol tray behind Hattie's armchair. "You know, sometimes a girl just needs to take her mind off of things and focus on herself, you know?" said Betty. "I've been focusing on me as much as I can when I'm not focusing on those kids," said Hattie. "I don't think I care much for them nowadays. I'd just like some more time with him beyond breakfast, dinner, and a 3-minute weekend catch-up." Instead of the alcohol tray, Betty positioned herself behind Hattie's armchair and stood behind her unnoticed.
"Maybe you could try something else?"
Betty asked. "I think I'm already thinking about it."
"Oh yeah?"
Hattie, confused by the suggestiveness and closeness of Betty's voice, turned to face her, only to be greeted by Betty grabbing her by the cheeks and leaning towards her at rapid speed for a kiss on the lips. Without hesitation, Hattie removed Betty's hands and moved her head before striking Betty across the face. Betty grasped her face and moved away in shock until she hit her back against the wall. An enraged Hattie stood up and looked at Betty with fury in her eyes.
"I advise you to get the hell out of my house and go and join your other queer-mite lady friends down at the diner before all of your equally unavailable husbands get there."
Hattie grabbed the wine glasses before entering the kitchen. Betty felt incredibly foolish but refused to let her pride slip. After awkwardly standing around for what felt like an hour, she took a seat on the couch, put her shoes back on, grabbed her bag, and headed straight for the front door. Hattie did not even bat an eye as Betty grabbed her lush red coat off of the coat hanger and slammed the front door behind herself. Hattie stopped washing up and sighed deeply. The phone on the kitchen wall rang, startling her. She groaned, dried her hands on a cloth hanging over the sink, and answered the phone.
Back at the warehouse, Neo was at work in his labour-friendly attire, helping to relocate some larger boxes to another area. In the midst of it, he patted a co-worker on the back and requested a cigarette, to which the co-worker obliged. Neo took one and walked through the rolling gate opening. He jumped down from the platform onto the ground below, walking out onto the warehouse parking lot as a large truck moved in and backed up towards the platform. Neo pulled out his Zippo lighter and sparked up. He pulled his grandfather's pocket watch out of his breast pocket and fiddled with it as he smoked. As the ticking became louder to him, and all other sounds began to drown out, the pulse started again, and Neo saw flashes of his grandfather giving him the watch with each pulse. The old, frail voice of his grandfather whispered in his ears like a devil on his shoulder. He began to see some of the other bizarre and disturbing visions he saw earlier. There was a new one added to the mix. Nathan, dressed in an all-white suit with a creepy blank mask, was speaking on the phone at a desk in the middle of a black void with white tiled floors. As the pulse abruptly stopped and he returned to the real world, Neo, without even realizing he was doing it, crushed the watch in his hand before sprinkling its pieces onto the ground. His lacerated palm began to bleed, but he didn't seem to care or feel pain from it. He finished the cigarette, stamped it out, and began to pick out pieces of the watch from his wounded flesh before heading back to the warehouse. As his co-workers continued to go about their jobs, Neo approached them and helped. His blood got on the box he picked up and his co-workers caught on almost instantly, each of them shocked and repulsed. Neo went to grab another box before being stopped by one of the other men. He was calm, but they still felt the vibe that grabbing him had irritated him. "Jesus Christ, Smite," said one of the co-workers. "Are you okay?" Neo tried to reply, but couldn't seem to get the words out. He simply put his uninjured hand over his wounded one and made his way further into the warehouse. The workers looked on in confusion. One of them rounded up the others to deal with the contaminated box.